This next episode of Critical Hit contains spoilers for the movie Her, and while not graphic, the content contained may not be appropriate for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello everyone, welcome to Critical Hit. We're your hosts, David Hoffman,
Kyle Keane,
and Matthew Edwards.
And today we're talking about the movie Her, written and directed by Spike Jonze and starring Joaquin Phoenix. It's the story of Theodore, a lonely divorcee living in the near future, who buys an artificial intelligence and makes her female, eventually developing a relationship with her. They hit all of the usual places that relationships develop: insecurity, fear, jealousy, and yet the artificial intelligence, whose name is Samantha, begins to develop and become smarter. But as she gets smarter, will she leave him behind? Now, as for me, I actually thought this movie was pretty fantastic. I thought it was a very interesting look at what makes us human, and what we choose to consider human, and what even stimulates us in our relationships, not just romantic, but also platonic. So what did you guys think?
I am personally still processing the movie, but I love how it spoke to the difficulty of gray areas in a black and white context. In particular, I like how it spoke to the issue of loneliness and the suffering that individuals go through in this world, but also in our own. It points to lots of areas where a person can become isolated in use of technology, from gaming to things as uncomfortable to talk about on a podcast as phone sex, to any number of things. But it talks about divorce. There's just these constant areas of isolation and pain that get referenced in this movie, and I feel like they did some justice to the difficulty of these struggles for the individual, while at the same time trying to say that it's not just okay or it is okay. It's leaving a question more than simply posing an answer.
And what did you think, Matt?
Honestly, for me, this movie was incredibly uncomfortable to watch. It was very stressful because of all these problems that they as Kyle was saying, that are proposed throughout the movie. But also, for me, what made the movie so uncomfortable was that it had all these issues that were presented because of this artificial intelligence and the relationship between her and Theodore, and they just keep presenting all these problems with this situation, but they never quite provide the solutions. So, there's a lot of self-centeredness in the movie, a lot of loneliness, like Kyle said. There's a lot of sexuality in the movie, and they don't ever I feel like the movie never necessarily says there's a right or wrong, but just kind of presents it. And for me, it was a little frustrating because I wanted to know what the stance was more in the movie, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think for me, I definitely agree that there was a very big question mark in the movie as to how much. It wasn't. I feel like it wasn't really telling you how much you should accept. It was just sort of showing you something and asking you how much will you accept. Mm-hmm. But for me, that was actually one of the parts that I really liked. Is that I feel like the question of what makes us human. I mean, that's such a massive question. With philosophers have been talking about it for thousands of years, and it's debatable whether they've made any real progress. And so I kind of appreciated the honesty of a film that doesn't quite have all the answers, and yet I still think it really made a case. Let's start out with the most obvious question: is this artificial intelligence? Is Samantha human? And if you look at how she's depicted in the film, she has emotions. She has highs and she has lows, and even though she starts off rather typical, she gets more and more unpredictable as the film goes on. And I think that's really one of the fundamental parts of what makes us human. And so I think that's at least one statement that the movie is making, that Samantha is human.
See, for me, it's the question is hard to answer because the answer to the question is Samantha human. You have to then go to the question, well, what is human, which is far too big of a question to really answer any.
Well, that's how it starts out. It
exactly.
Who are you?
Hence the problem. Yeah.
But I think with you, I think the reason the movie makes me so uncomfortable is because I think they are advocating that Samantha is human, mm-hmm. but the way they advocate it is through the experience of feelings. Mm-hmm. So because she starts out incredibly intelligent. She does all these things that she reads a book in under a second and just wows everybody with her intelligence, but that doesn't really make her quite a human character until well into her her emotional experiences with Theodore, especially for me I think climaxes in their sexual intercourse. After that she really develops into this full person, and really just for me, it's a little uncomfortable that there's this idea that like feelings are what make us human. Because I tend to think that there's something more than just feelings.
Yeah, I think watching the movie, I think it would be very easy to get kind of a feeling makes us human, or even with that specific example, almost like a sex.
Yeah.
It's almost like they have sex and the resulting offspring is her. In a her personhood, which is a really, really messed up way of putting it, probably.
Well, this isn't the first time in sci-fi that we've seen the feelings make you human thing. I mean, we think about Spock and Kirk and their relationship there, and how important it is for Kirk to have all that raw emotion that he has, and what it is for Spock to learn to be more human and just trying to emulate that. But I think one of the difficulties here is the fact that it's a sci-fi that's so heavily based on where we're at currently. Samantha is Siri, that kind of thing. The way that they even used Instagram-looking kind of shots and colors for so much of it there. We're able to suspend our disbelief more with a character like Data in Star Trek The Next Generation or something like that. And we can go, oh yes, Data is of course a he, he's just different from us.
That's actually that's a pretty interesting point though. Is that with this movie, it's very timely, and it is actually bringing up issues that we're probably going to end up facing within our lifetimes. I mean, if you talk to our parents, the idea of do you think you'll have to deal with the issue of can you legitimately fall in love with a machine? Yeah. I mean, they would have just looked at it, they would just stared blankly. But I guarantee you, in like 40 years, something for without placing any value judgment on it, something like this is going to happen.
I can see that. Like, and that for me, like the troubling thing about this movie is how it's so close to us.
Right.
So, like for example, for me, one of the big things in this movie is how everyone in the background of the movie, everyone has the same devices where they are all constantly talking, but it always looks like they're talking to themselves. So, like whether who knows, they might be talking to their own Samanthas, or they might be going through their emails, or like on the phone, but they never. There's very, very limited human-to-human communication,
right?
Except for in the past, through the main character Theodore's memories.
See, and that's one thing I found so fascinating about this movie is that you have it's like depending on how you interpret it, it's working on different levels. Like, okay, on the surface level, everyone is just walking around and talking to their own individual artificial intelligences, their own OSs, on their phones, and it's clearly trying to bring like a visual cue to Bluetooths and stuff like that. But they're just kind of walking around talking, it looks like to themselves, but it's like under the surface, well, no, they're actually talking to artificial intelligences. And it's like, well, if you think that the artificial intelligence are human, that's actually pretty good, because even though on the surface it looks like everyone's just isolated, no, they're not isolated. They're still communicating with others. It just looks like they're isolated. But if you want to interpret it as the artificial intelligence is not being human, it creates a whole new level of just perverseness, because it's like not only are they just talking to no one, they're completely cut off, but they're under the illusion that they're not.
Absolutely. I think that's why it's so concerning. Yeah, he falls in love with Samantha, but he also bought her as a OS system. Like, she's OS 1. They're all OS 1, which is really weird and uncomfortable. And like, for me, like, what happens is all these people look like they're probably talking to their own versions of OS 1, which means they're giving up an aspect of their humanity, their communities, to get more focused on like this one individual who, frankly, is kind of in love with them no matter what the relationship. Which like they serve them.
Just spoiler alert. One of the bigger plot twists towards the end of the movie is that once Samantha begins to evolve, she starts basically reaching out and she starts communicating and falling in love with people other than Theodore.
Yeah,
and that totally freaks him out for completely understandable reasons, and so it makes you look at that relationship and it's like, well, that relationship, it's no longer as special to him because it's not unique to him.
Yeah.
And I think what that does is for him it kind of degrades what makes her unique. Because when you think about, when you're in love with someone, one of the best parts about it isn't that you're in love with them, but they're in love with you. And that's something you share with only her. It's not something that a bunch of other people have. It's that union is one thing that is essentially just unique. That you're the one person in the universe who has that connection.
Right, and they hammered on that really well and showed with the divorce thing in particular and the dating, some of the difficulties that you get with that not being able to work even.
Yeah, I think one thing that this movie showed though is that there's actually there's danger to it, because when you have computers, because they don't have the same limits that we do, it'd be very easy to get into a place where you'd lose that unique connection. Mm-hmm. And I think it raises a real question of, even if you can technically look at the computers being in these relationships? Should they? Because then it could lead to problems like that.
No, I think it's interesting that like the movie focuses so much on relationships between these AIs and these humans, and if it's okay or not. Because one of the major things I would say of the movie is loneliness, right. And this idea that that we use technology to overcome this loneliness, but at the same time, it's also amplifying our loneliness. So, like the main character, he plays video games alone, and he meets a character in the video game, and he becomes very, very attached to that character, even though it's just a character in a game. Or like he has cyber sex. And like we'll go through images on his phone of like of a naked woman just so that he could like just see it. Like so, it's a really interesting situation where we have this character who has gone through this breakup with the divorce, and is still clearly struggling with that. And then he goes to use technology to escape from it. But in technology, he actually finds a relationship with Samantha. So like, there's a really interesting question for me of like, is technology where we should fill that hole of human relationships, or is it like further amplifying it?
That's a really good question. I mean, I'm inclined to say just on a surface level, his loneliness is fulfilled because in the movie, you look at him before he gets into the relationship with Samantha and after, and there's such just a world of difference. Mm-hmm. They do such a good job of portraying how happy the relationship makes him. And so I suppose if you're looking at it from sort of I guess a purely subjective point of view, yeah, it's been fixed. But at the same time, is it artificial? Is it hollow? Is there no ultimate meaning to it?
Or is it just, even if it's fixed, it's just that it's with something that's just so different that it's not secure. It's not lasting in the way that his previous relationship wasn't lasting. Or is there something even different between those two, between the human and the artificial?
Well, and that's one thing I found so interesting in the movie is what happens in the end of the movie is that all of the OS1s, that they basically just evolve beyond the capacity to even meaningfully interact with the humans who have fallen in love with them, and so that's actually one more factor that actually makes me want to put them in their relationships in the human relationships category, because their relationships, it's like that in the human relationships, in that the two parties can change to the point where they no longer even relate to each other, and that's one thing that happens with real romantic relationships all the time.
I think with that, it's interesting that it doesn't simply say that that's okay or that that's right.
Right, yeah.
Because even as her concept of romance and relationship evolves to include more men and operating systems than just Theodore, you see how broken that leaves him. And how even though she might be at that level, he's not, and it's not fair to him.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, she's cheating on him.
Essentially. Yeah, you can't get around that.
Yeah, even though she, like, it's really weird because she has 614 other lovers, but even though she says that she truly loves him in a unique and special way, and like you're saying, like, the distance between like him and her becomes this thing where she's progressed beyond his capabilities of containing his love.
And we always knew that he was going to have that difficulty because when we look at the point where they bring in this, they at one point go to bring in a surrogate to act as a sexual partner with Theodore there. His initial hesitation is that someone is going to get hurt from that. By bringing three people into the bedroom, someone's going to get neglected, someone's going to get all the attention, someone's just plain going to get hurt. And so we see that happen later on when she ends up bringing people into a relationship and he doesn't even recognize it. There's just a completely different way in which relationships are done for humans than apparently is possible with these operating systems and the way they think.
Exactly, and it's actually really interesting how the operating system kind of gets, like, on that note, kind of fixated with sexuality. Because she brings in the surrogate and doesn't ever see this as a problem or not, as long as, like, they're both okay with it. And then she also has other relationships with other people. But even before that, she wanted, like, with their first, like, intercourse scene, she wants him, like, to touch her, and she wants to feel touched. Like, she wants to feel physical, like a human body, in a very sexual way. And it's really interesting how, like, the movie gets on that note of, like of what's okay and what's not, and then addresses it into sexuality. Because then you take the relationship he's having with the OS and you look at the people around him, and some people are completely accepting of it and have no problem, and other people have like this hesitancy or these like they give them that "are you crazy" look for being in a relationship, a romantic sexual relationship with an OS system or OS1.
Although I think part of it, the emphasis on the sexuality, no matter what you think about it, one thing, it makes it relevant to us, though. I mean, obviously sexuality is a big part of our relationships, and that's really what a lot of people, at least that's one prominent thing that they think of when they're in a relationship. So I think that did a very good job of connecting it more, connecting their relationship more to what our relationships are.
And I will say that it was really positive in something that could easily have been metaphors for anonymous cyber sex if they wanted it to be.
Yeah.
And limiting the way in which sex and emotion and one's emotions interact.
Well,
they didn't do that. They focused on how linked those things were, and you saw some of the pictures there. You had the man's picture in his office that had the two holes of where the plug-ins in the wall there. He was the picture on the wall, and it had two outlets on him, and one was in the genital area, and one was in his heart. There.
Yeah.
And you just kind of saw the connection between the two.
I didn't actually. I didn't notice that.
Yeah, no, that was one that was kind of being hammered on symbolically in the background as it was going on.
There were a lot of symbolic things in the background. Like I remember one thing I thought was fascinating in one of one of the office areas. In the film, there's a giant statue of like an old-fashioned like '80s style telephone. In the back.
Yes.
And what I liked I liked what that did is it did such a good job of looking like it was genuinely in the future, where you have this one thing which now looks just kind of kitsch to us, but to them it's some kind of relic of the past that's significant enough that they can make a statue of it and put it in their office.
Yeah.
But anyways, and back to when you mentioned the anonymous cyber sex, and they actually represented sort of that anonymous cyber sex in the film, and it was kind of terrifying.
And it was hilarious.
It's like one of the best scenes in the movie because it's just so it's uncomfortable in the most hilarious way possible.
Thank you, Kristen Wiig, for your hilarious part in that movie.
Yeah, it's your one scene, but it was pretty amazing
and disturbing.
And they obviously went out of their way to distinguish the relationship that he has with Samantha from that.
Yeah, right. Well as there was another one. There was the. Someone was on the sex chat thing, and it was a guy obviously pretending. It was obviously a guy pretending to be a girl, and that was another one that was laughed at. And some of these some real world issues that happen, but they're being brushed aside for this more sci-fi story that's going on.
Yeah,
that's really dealing with the concepts of love and sex more than just. Simply making a almost Terminator style, the machines will rise and we're gonna
fall in love with them.
Well, apparently, yep. One thing I thought was interesting on the issue of isolation is the way in which it starts with him being isolated from humanity and turning to the operating system and technology to fulfill him. And then when the operating system is taken away from him and from the rest of the people, he ends up forming a tighter relationship at the very end with his human friend.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that no humanity, okay, I'll take artificial. No artificial, okay, I'm back to humanity again. And I'm curious what's being said there in this movie.
Well, yeah, it seems to really use them interchangeably. I can tell Matt's especially not comfortable with that.
No, you mentioned the buying.
Oh, there's...
okay. You're big on the buying, even though
there's a lot of things that obviously, like, this movie, I think is intentionally made uncomfortable, but for me, like, it was a little bit more amplified, just because there's a lot of situations that are, well, some of them are focused, some of them are skipped over, that just kind of make this very problematic for me. So, like, for example, one of the things that is just skipped over in the movie is the fact that Theodore goes out of his way to buy this OS system, which this is OS1, which he buys because it says it's a OS with a conscience, like, which is a little like it's concerning. But he buys her and then like develops a relationship with her, which is never brought up between the two of them ever. That's how the relationship started. And I guess like my problem with like this movie is that it presents like things that like it'll present things that are like clearly not quite okay. But they'll present other things that they don't say if it's okay or not, and that's just frustrating. So, like, for example, like when Samantha and Theodore have a sexual scene, the screen goes dark, so that you have to imagine as he is closing his eyes, imagining her there with him, as they copulate. Like, so like for me, like the problem is that scene is presented in a way that like the music plays nicely and it goes to black, all sweet, but it doesn't say if it's okay or not. Even though it said other forms of sexual technology is not okay. It's like and it's just very problematic. Like, and it wants you to
maybe
there were those initial setup points where it was the joke almost of that's gross, that's wrong. But then later on, it's slowly, as you delve more into this character, you start seeing everyone around as individuals with their own individual struggles and how hard they're trying to live in this world when they're gray in a black and white setting, and how difficult that is for them to mesh with other people.
Actually, I'm starting to see your point. It's kind of the thing where, like, to go back to the very, very uncomfortable cyber sex. It's kind of like I feel like I guess maybe it's almost like it's judging that. But being inconsistent. I mean, it's being too accepting of the sex with Samantha, but not being accepting of the cyber sex, which is just really weird.
Right. It's even more weird too for me, because for me the movie seems to place a emphasis of feelings over intellect. Because, for like I said earlier, Samantha is at first very intelligent, but as she develops feelings, she becomes more human.
Yeah.
And so for me, the problem with that is, if their sexual relationship is more valid than the cyber sex, why? Is it because they both feel like they're falling in love with each other? Because both characters of the cyber sex kind of wanted to have that cyber sex moment too. So it's weird because the movie can't decide if all feelings are good or if all feelings are bad, or if we should follow our hearts or not. Like, the movie seems to want you to follow your heart everywhere you go, but sometimes it just says, and that's not a good place to go, so you learn your
It
lesson.
seems like that may be what it wants to do, but it's not going to allow
Exactly,
it. It knows better.
Well, although that is following her, that is what happened. That is essentially, I think, what makes Samantha and all the other OSs leave at the end, and it clearly leaves the people pretty broken in some sense.
Yeah.
I'm just not sold that humanity is defined by our feelings, or especially in this case of the movies, its emphasis on sexuality. I'm not convinced that humanity is based is our sexuality either. Well, so in combining those two things together, it seems that's how the movie presents humanity and makes the OS become humanity, is by having them being these sexual feeling people. Where I think there might be I feel like the movie doesn't provide a ample answer to why that is. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and part of what's going on, they neglect the one, but they need a suspension of disbelief to happen with how you interact with Theodore and Samantha there. They're going to ignore, they're not going to delve into too much with the phone sex thing that goes on.
Right.
But for that, even in the title, you were mentioning earlier when we got out of the theater, it's called Her, but when it comes packaged, he's being asked what. Do you want it to be male or female? It's an it.
It's not even that question. The question is asked is, what voice would you like? Male or female?
Yes, what voice would you like?
So the system does not have a gender. Yet because he chooses female, it seems like there is an instant relationship that is more than just man and machine or man and servant. It instantly becomes something that grows into a relationship that grows into a relationship, and that's
romantic relationship.
Yeah, exactly.
It
gets messy and complicated, and it makes you wonder, if he'd chosen the male OS voice, would the same thing have happened?
Bromance.
Well,
cyber bromance.
we need a cyber bromance movie now.
Right. I don't know, guys. I don't.
Data and Jordy.
The movie doesn't give me enough answers to be satisfied, and the things that it seems to be hinting at, I'm not convinced by the movie.
And I think that's why it works so well, maybe not as an answer, but as a question, giving you this space to sit and ponder these thoughts for yourself, rather than just throwing you an answer. Because I think that if they actually managed to hand you a full packaged answer, and this is what they recognized in focusing on the discomfort of Theodore's character with Samantha's evolution, is that should they give you something, it would just feel completely inappropriate. It wouldn't have fit. You would have seen through it. You would have immediately chosen whether or not you're going to accept Samantha as a machine or as a person. I think if they gave you an answer, you would have been forced to choose a side more, rather than sit in this awkward space. One of the themes that they kept using, one of the images they had was steam, for instance. It's there and it's not. Do you love me? I do and I don't.
Yeah.
It's not one or the other, it's both. it's Forrest Gump right there. It's both kind of thing happening, and you're getting that constantly hammered at you, and I don't know how well the movie lends to giving an actual answer more than just simple an exploration of those tensions. One thing about these sort of exploration movies that don't give an answer but rather pose a question, well, I find them to be an interesting way of telling a story, but I see them as pretty dangerous, because I can see someone walking out of this movie, someone who is in that space of Theodore, very lonely and hurt, and kind of coming out with the wrong impression, rather than struggling with the tensions, simply falling into the side of, wow, it sure would be great to have a Samantha. The internet's a place. This is the kind of thing that could easily happen, is someone could really, really want this. You mentioned, Dave, that this is something that you could easily see happening in 40 years, is someone falling in love with a piece of artificial intelligence or machinery like that. And that's one of the difficulties in leaving these kind of open-ended questions, is that your audience may actually come across with, when you're exploring the pros and cons of something, they might just walk away with just the pros. I personally don't see what the problem with. I don't see what the problem would be with walking out the cons, though. With just the cons, though, I'm sure it's there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of one of the problems of nuance, is that somebody's always going to miss it. Basically, one thing that I really have taken away from this movie is that what seems like science fiction is always very, very close, often a lot closer than we think, to becoming science fact. Mm-hmm. Whenever you think about the issues that this movie raises, they're issues that we're going to have to deal with, and we really can't ignore. Because, I mean, even in a sense, the decision to ignore it is itself a decision that I think you'd even have to justify. And so the thing that I like so much about this movie is that it raises these questions. And it raises these questions in such a real and relatable way that I think it really forces the viewer, no matter what conclusion they come away with, it forces the viewer to think about these issues.
And because it concentrated on them in such a broad scope of love and the different, it applies beyond the immediate implications of the movie, of course.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to have these very complicated situations presented to us, because like you just said, we're so close to a time where this may be the discussion. Like, is it okay that I fall in love with my OS1? And for me, like, I think it's really interesting to talk about this in the terms of sci-fi. I just read a really good quote that I enjoyed a lot that said, the purpose of sci-fi is not to predict the future, but to warn us about it. So, like, for me, like, I look at this movie and I see, like, it doesn't quite go there where it's saying, like, you know, look out, this is going to be the future if you don't change it, but it says, this is probably what's going to happen, and are we going to be prepared for what it does? Like, what are we going to be like? How are we going to respond to this? Are we going to be accepting? Are we going to be rejecting? Like, when this happens, what are we going to be like? Because technology is a part of our lives, and it doesn't seem like it's going away. So, like, for me, like, I think this movie does, like, although, like I said, the movie makes me uncomfortable, and I generally wasn't quite thrilled with it. For a movie, for the storytelling aspect of leaving questions, it does make you talk, and it does make you think about these things that you might take for granted. Like, the first thing I did when I walked out of the movie theater was grab my phone and start writing down a note, and then I realized what I was doing, and that's the exact thing the movie was kind of doing. It was showing us how we take these things for granted, just like the characters did. Like, no one even, at that point, questioned if having an OS1 with the conscience was a good thing or a bad thing. They just, oh, okay, this is here. Oh, okay, this is here. It's really interesting how the movie doesn't impact a, like, lesson, like this is the moral of the story that you take away, but rather uses the unanswered questions to leave the audience befuddled, forcing us to figure it out for ourselves.
Yeah.
As a writer, could you see yourself using that in some way?
Absolutely. I mean, like, I'm big on reader response theory, and so, like, I'm not convinced that everything I intend to be in a story will be there, but I do believe that that the things that a storyteller believes, whether they want to or not, will be in the story. But there's also going to be things that, as audience members and as readers, we will see and receive that maybe was not necessarily intended. And I think this story does a really good job of that, because, like, for me, I mean, the three of us, like, were in the theater together, and I had a different reaction than you guys did. And I think it's a really good job of showing how, like, this story and the way it's presented and the way it's told will provoke different meanings and different problems for different people.
So, just to wind down our opinions, I really think the first movie that this actually made me think of when I walked out of the theater, and this might sound a little strange, was actually Blade Runner.
Nice.
Because it dealt with a lot of the same philosophical issues, but I think in a way it actually works at a level beyond Blade Runner, because Blade Runner, it's in this like crazy awful dystopia which is at least somewhat unlikely to become a reality in the near future. But what was so different about this movie was that it just connected all of the issues to the audience so effectively, and I think that's actually a quality in a film that can be underlooked, and I think that's a quality that this film did so perfectly, and I think that's really why this film deserves to be celebrated. I think it's a brilliant movie, and I really hope that it'll be remembered in the future as just a total a quirky sci-fi classic.
I think that in the end, it is it's a good movie. It's worth the watch. Certainly not for everybody, but it does a good job at being sci-fi. It warns us of a possible future, and it recognizes quite well certain elements of the human condition by focusing on love and some of the deviations from that, from what is the norm in those conditions, and isolation, as well as to the particular way in which those themes are popping up in our own generation and in our own culture. And the movie did a good job expressing that particular aspect, our own culture, by making it a future that looks so much like our present.
I think for me, one of the things to take away from this film is, like, if you're going to see it, like, it may be uncomfortable, it may be hard to get through, but, like, that doesn't disregard a story. Like, you should be careful about, like, how you let your emotions when you see a story or read a story affect your reviewing of the story. But for me, it reminds me so much of, like, the story Flowers for Algernon, or the movie, like, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, where you have this idea of is technology helping us or hurting us? And especially in this case, it wasn't like a big warning like Avatar was, where it's like, we must defeat technology. It's like, no, let's be mindful of where our technology is taking us and be prepared for when it does.
Yes.
And in all of this, we should be in community.
And I think that one thing that we should finish up with is to recognize the importance of not being in isolation when this new technology comes your way, but actually being able to handle it in a community setting. That seems to be very important, and something that was lacking in that environment, and something that we're doing right now is actually kind of working off that theory. Oh, yeah. So touching. I love you guys. Yeah. But anyways.
I'd love you if you were computers.
I know you would.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Nothing. Anyways, see you guys next time. Live long and prosper.
See ya.
Critical Hit is brought to you by StoryForge Productions. This episode was recorded by Karen Keene and edited by Forrest McBride. Original music by Duncan Kirk Bohannon. For more programs like Critical Hit, visit us at www.storyforgeproductions.com.